We're going to get started. Good afternoon, good evening, and wonderful to be here. I am your host for the evening, hopefully to facilitate a really inspiring discussion. And welcome to the Rethinking the State Festival, which is an annual event, and hopefully many of you were participating in some of the earlier discussions, which I heard were really inspiring and rich. So my name is Leslie Johnston. I am the chief exec of a foundation called Loudest Foundation. It's a private foundation very much trying to tackle some of the issues that you'll hear Mariana talk about later today. And fun fact, our first grant ever was to IIPP. So we've been a long-term partner of Mariana and the Institute. We only were formed in 2020, so we're 5 years old. But for me, it's such an honor and a privilege to be standing here amongst all of you and amongst our esteemed panelists, which is actually an all-star, all-female panel, so no manels. It's very exciting.
Except the movers of the furniture.
Yeah, and because we're female, we had to get the furniture moving in exactly the right, constellation. But I'm a firm believer in the need to redesign the incentives and the ideas of our system, because if we don't, we're stuck in this mess, and there's a lot that needs to happen under that iceberg. So maybe one thought before we kick off. Mariana's going to say her usual brilliance, but at the end of the day, what got us where we are now is not going to get us to where we need to go. And we need a different frame of mind for how we think, how we act. We need new ideas. We need a new platform, like the Strategic Economics Alliance, for example, which you'll hear about. Spoiler alert, we need new theory, new practice, and new voices. And it's the second piece that I get really excited about, because the new voices is something that we don't usually hear enough about. And I want to share my joy at seeing how deeply embedded inclusivity is in the topic we're going to talk about today. As a foundation focused on rights and helping people to understand their rights and advocate for their rights, that's really important. We're not going to transition to a green, fair, and inclusive economy if we're not getting the right voices at the table. And personally, I've been very inspired by the call out that many of you may have heard. I think it actually comes from the South Africa Disability Movement, which is nothing about us without us. That's very much a mantra that governs our own work at Loudest, and it's very much the core of what you're going to hear today when we talk about voices. So I have the very difficult task of introducing Mariana. It's like introducing your hero, but I will have a go. Professor Mariana Mazzucato, as you probably know, she is an intellectual powerhouse. She's effectively transforming the public sector, government by government, across the world in her very inspiring way. And you probably know she's the founding director and professor at UCL's Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose, Exhibit A. But she's also the author of 4 highly acclaimed books. How many of you have read her books? Great. We can look up at the camera when you put your hand. But no, they're fantastic books. In fact, the second book, which is around the value of everything, was the book that I read that actually informed some of the work we're doing at Loudest, which is how do you think about value and how do you redefine value. The other thing Mariana has done is that she's been an advisor to policymakers all over the world, really helping them think about innovation-led ways of working, inclusivity, sustainable growth. No, it's not an oxymoron. And she sits and chairs many, many commissions to try to bring that thinking to the world. So without further ado, let me give the floor to Mariana.
This, as Leslie said, is actually the evening kind of keynote to what is going to be an annual festival, so the Rethinking the State Festival, which actually began as a getting together of 100-ish organizations that we brought together through the Institute, through the network of those organizations called the Mission-Oriented Innovation Network. Nora's here, who's been running that network, and we decided this year to actually really broaden it out to the bigger umbrella subject, which is rethinking the state. And it's not because the state is any more important than any other actor, but we know that any of the biggest challenges we have out there will not happen without capable, agile, flexible public sector workers working alongside the private sector, civil society, and so on. But the level to which the state itself has been untheorized, unlike the private sector where people go to MBA programs and are trained to think out of the box and all these great courses like strategic management, organizational behavior, decision sciences. If we continue to think about the role of the state as just fixing a market failure, it's not surprising that the types of policies that we have are always a bit too little too late, a bit lame, a bit depressed, fixing, enabling, de-risking, so on and so forth. So we end up with patchy policies by design. So I'm incredibly happy to have this panel, which again Leslie is going to introduce later. And I'm really just going to give a sense of also why we've just set up a new alliance that we will be talking about, which I co-chair with Carolina Alves, who's here as my co-chair from the Institute, which is all about not just the new theory, new practice, and the practice-based theorizing, which IIPP talks about all the time, but actually the need to bring new voices. We can't just replicate the siloed, skewed, unjust ways that we've structured previous financial institutions, for example, with the umbrella now of new economic thinking. If there aren't new voices at the table, then we are just creating new problems that'll have to be fixed later. So we've also actually been working very closely recently with the UN. Luca, who's up there, was up there, who was one of our master's students in the MPA program. We've been working actually closely with the Summit of the Future of the Secretary General and Amina Mohammed, who's the Deputy Secretary General. Last year, alongside the Secretary General, had a big conference at the UN saying, what is this? We talk about all these goals, these 17 ambitious SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, but we're actually going backwards. And we're not only not achieving them, but actually going backwards, and the need for actually rethinking how the economy works, how business and the private sector, business and the public sector should be working, but also what it means to have a goal-oriented system needs to be rethought. Otherwise, there's no point about talking about goals. And this is very much why we actually set up IIPP, which is if we have public purpose, right, this nice sexy word, purpose, goals, climate change, the health preparedness that we need for the next pandemic, what does it mean to actually structure the economic system to deliver on that? And I had the honor to actually chair the World Health Organization Council on the Economics of Health for All for the last 2 years, actually during COVID. And what we did as an all-woman council representing all the different continents was to start with that question. If we have a goal around health for all, which obviously are a lot of sub-goals, what does it mean not just to say invest in health and it's good for the economy, but what does it mean to say if the goal is, for example, vaccinating the world, how do you structure the economic system to actually deliver on that goal? It's a very different question from just saying invest in health and it will have a multiplier effect and it's good for the economy, which by the way it is, right? The cost of inaction is greater than the cost of action for health, for climate, and so on. But what does a goal-oriented economy look like? And in IIPP, we're constantly saying that we need not just new theory, new practice, but also new story, right? This new narrative that we actually need of the policymaking process itself, the new language, the new vocabulary. We like to cross stuff off, so away from fixing market failures towards co-creating and shaping markets. The market itself is not business. The market is an outcome of how we govern and structure all the different entities in the economy, public, private, labor unions, civil society organizations, and how they work together, badly, well, parasitically, symbiotically, so on and so forth, determines the kind of markets we have. So by definition, we have to, are you guys looking at a lot of water here? Or, I'm just going to keep micromanaging this entire thing. So by definition, it has to be framed as shaping markets, shaping the economy, if we care to have an economy that's inclusive, that's sustainable, that's innovation-driven, away from de-risking towards welcoming uncertainty, experimentation. Rainer Cattell, my deputy director, one of my deputy directors, also David Eves, ran a great workshop today around capacity building. What is capacity building? What are the dynamic capabilities of the public sector if it is going to be agile, flexible, able to work dynamically in a goal-oriented way? What is the training? What's the new curriculum we need? And that's why we're also very proud in IIPP to be a department. We're not just an institute, even though it's called an institute. It's not just an institute in an old school economics department. It's actually a department itself. What does that mean? We get to rewrite the curriculum itself. So one of the things we're most proud of is actually rewriting the MPA curriculum, the Master's in Public Administration curriculum, to be as sexy as the MBA program, where managers are encouraged to think creatively and to think of things like rejuvenating the mature corporation. Why? Because when corporations get large, they get a bit inertial, a bit slow. When public institutions get inertial and slow, we roll our eyes and say, bureaucracy. Picking the willing, not winners, right? How do you actually galvanize, catalyze a true Keynesian multiplier effect across the whole economy? If you're goal-oriented, how do you get all your different tools, procurement, grants, loans, the portfolio of all the different instruments to actually help tilt the playing field in a direction, not by micromanaging everyone, but having a clear direction, leaving open the how, but using all those tools to bring in those who are willing to move with you. So again, away from picking winners, technology, sectors, types of firms, because they're small. Why? Just because you're small should you get support, right? If you're small and willing, and trying to actually do something difficult, to transform, to innovate, you'll need extra support because you're small, but this isn't just about size. We talk a lot about that need to invest within capacity building instead of outsourcing it. Reiner's leading with myself a project around the public sector capabilities index, just like there are these a bit dysfunctional indices out there, like the ease of doing business index, which is basically how much do you screw over workers index, how much can you get rid of different institutional asymmetries index. This is a very different type of index. How much are you investing within those very much needed capacities and capabilities that we know are central for public sector workers to work alongside other actors? And how can we actually encourage that, not so much just through a ranking that makes people feel top or bottom of the index, but really encourage that transformation. And of course, evaluation. There's no point in doing cool things around environment, around health, if then the way we evaluate those policies continues to be wed to very static measures around cost-benefit analysis, net present value. Again, these boring questions like which market failure did you fix? What are those dynamic metrics that we need in our green books? That's what they call it here in the Treasury, the green book, which is the way the government actually evaluates its policies. And we try to bring in wonderful scholars, but also that new wave of scholars in our PhD program. But that new theory that we're putting out there in books and papers and so on only makes sense if we actually test it out, right? Like I wrote a book called The Entrepreneurial State. What does that actually mean within a public bank? What does it mean for how it sets up its risk-reward relationship within a portfolio? What is the definition of public value and actually risk within a public bank versus a private bank? So bringing these kind of new theories, and I've just put up here some books by some of our professors, including Josh Ryan Collins's great work on land, on rent. We worked together actually on a new theory of rent, modern economic rents. The great book that just came out by Reiner that I already mentioned about an entrepreneurial state. How does it actually mean for the structure of the bureaucracy itself? I see some of our PhD students here, like Josh Ensminger, who's doing a PhD on that topic. The wonderful book by Carlota Perez, and she's just about to publish her other magnum, big work? Opus, text. She's the age of what my mother would be today. My mother passed away when she was 71, born in 1940. Carlota is competing with all of us to see if she can publish more than any of us within the next 10 years. And she has been publishing great works, but the new book she's writing is very much looking at, again, the last kind of 300 years of capitalism and what can we learn for a moment like this, where people talk about the state being back. What is the actual relationship between finance, between the productive sector, with policy leading, not micromanaging, but leading? What's the relationship that she has seen in different parts of the world, but also different phases of capitalism? Anyway, so what is the relationship between this great new theory, and there's many other books and papers that you can see on our website, with the practice? What we call practice-based theorizing is very much in some ways a call to action for economists to become a bit more humble. That's not one of our greatest traits, and I speak for myself too. We're very good at talking and talking too fast and then asking, where's the water? Because I've talked so much I'm getting dehydrated, and then saying, oh, here's my conclusion for what you should do. That doesn't work, right? You can write the most brilliant papers and have the last bit of your paper or book say policy conclusions. It's usually going to be a very how do you say, uninteresting, uncurious, and ineffective way of working. So what we've said is, while in parallel that we're trying to push out this new economic thinking by working with policymakers, whether it was when we worked in setting up a whole new public bank in Scotland, working today with Mia Motley on her mission-oriented industrial strategy to make her small island state or large ocean state one of the cleanest, greenest in the world. What is the experience then on the ground? What happens when the can of worms opens up and we get our hands very dirty? To our understanding of the theory itself, the limits, the bottlenecks. So we bring back that learning to the theory itself and to the training, right? Because our pillars in IIPP are very much about the new theory, the new practice, and the new training, literally the curriculum. So this is just an example. Don't read it. You're just supposed to look at these pretty colors. But the work that we then do with governments, whether it's working with the UN Economics Commission of Latin America, with Barbados, with the Camden Wealth Fund, thinking of a community wealth fund, what can it learn also from the Norwegian wealth fund, but at a community level in terms of, again, risks, reward, socializing the rewards, not just the risks, community participation in the governance of a bank like that. The work we did, I see Dan Hill here as well, who's one of our honorary professors, the work we did with the British government around moving away from a sector-focused industrial strategy towards a challenge and mission-oriented industrial strategy, so that transport, one of Dan's great many areas of expertise, is no longer seen as a sector, but as a problem to solve around sustainable mobility. And all of a sudden, you have to look at lots of different sectors, both in the business sector, but also at the government level. This would be an interministerial kind of challenge, and we work very closely with the government on that. But what I was saying is that that work that we do, that kind of deep dives, and actually, Leslie, this is what you guys funded for us initially, the kind of lab, right, that kind of public lab way that IIPP wanted to get its hands dirty, that way of kind of constantly testing that theory with the practice and bringing it back is probably the thing we're most interested in. And if we don't do that, we just keep getting into this vicious cycle, right? That if we have a problematic way of thinking about fiscal space or theory of money, theory of finance, again, different people in the Institute are thinking about that, that affects then how we think about capacity itself. It affects how we think of what are the limits to budgets. It affects how we actually structure financial institutions, and this vicious cycle of kind of going down that patchy, fixing, de-risking, as opposed to, again, welcoming uncertainty and really thinking of productive capacity, directing growth, not just worrying about the rate of growth and all those different levers that I talked about before. If we don't think in this much more ambitious way, then we just are constantly feeding this very problematic loop. And what I'm really happy that we're going to be doing in the panel session, but also in what I'll talk about in my last kind of minute, even though I'm way over. I was given 20 minutes, and I'm talking already 14, so I will finish very soon, even though I've just gotten through the first 2 of many slides. So let me just kind of speed up a bit. The reason we called this new industrial kind of policy, what's new and what do we actually need to do today when the state is back, is that this is actually a very particular time in history where we're no longer being told, state, get out of the way, markets rule. It's actually a moment, if you look at the amount of money that's being spent globally in both the global north and the global south. We're going to question those terms in a second during the panel discussion. Big ecological transition program in Brazil. Large amounts of money being spent right now in the US between the IRA and the CHIPS Act and the COVID recovery funds, close to $5 trillion, $2 trillion in Europe with the next gen EU. But what does it mean to actually then question the how, the why, the what at that granular level, so we don't reproduce the problem simply with much more money? And this is what we want to be talking about. And the word industrial strategy, which used to be a blasphemy, now that it's actually back, we're out of the closet, we're admitting that industrial strategies actually have always existed. How do we use this opportunity to really make sure that how, so new types of policies, new catalytic ways for public and private to work together in a outcomes-oriented way, those new capacities and capabilities that we need within public institutions. Otherwise, even when the money arrives, whether it's through a World Bank loan or a next-gen EU program falling onto Italy, I'm from Italy, we're getting the biggest chunk right now of the European recovery program. It falls on arid, empty, outsourced public administrators. And not to say that there's not some wonderful, civil service people, for example, in Italy, absolutely, but if they're not invested in, and if their role continues just to be peripheral, fixing, enabling, de-risking, and so on, it's not surprising that even once the money arrives, we end up having to actually send the money back. That's actually what's happened in Italy, which I often call a high-income developing country by design, because of the problematic choices they've actually made in the last decades. And we're going to be, again, opening up this discussion at a much more global level. So money is not enough, we know that, and yet money is out there making people think the state is back, like that Economist cover you just saw. Industrial policy, the different programs, we've just written a paper about this also with Danny Roderick, it's back. But if we actually don't structure, for example, public-private partnerships to be less parasitic, where loans, for example, subsidies and guarantees are just given out with no demand for transformation by the sectors that are receiving those funds, then we end up, not surprisingly, with an inertial system that just has perhaps more profits, but those profits are not getting reinvested back into the system, let alone steering that system to become, again, more inclusive and sustainable. So that need to rethink government, rethink business, rethink finance, this has to be part of this new industrial strategy. It can't just be, oh, we've got a lot more money now because of a recovery program, post-financial crisis, post-COVID crisis, or even these climate funds that we need. Of course, due to that massive financial gap that's out there. The SDG financial gap is close to 7 trillion, but if we're just seeing it as a gap, that's part of the problem, right? A financial gap, what does that mean? There's like a hole to fill with money versus questioning the structure of the finance itself. So the quality. We need patient, long-term, committed, outcomes-oriented finance, not just quick exit-driven finance, which we've seen in venture capital, or large financial loans from the Bretton Woods system, which don't have the voices of the global South at the table and actually thinking about not only what the finance is for, but how to structure it in ways that broaden instead of restricting the fiscal space. Let me just actually finish with this slide here because I don't want to go over. These are really the different areas that we've been thinking about in the Institute, which we wanted to bring to the table now with this wonderful new alliance that we're kind of announcing tonight. I'm not sure how many of you picked up the brochure, but this is also why I asked Boholo and Erica and Carolina, my co-chair of this alliance, to be on the panel. This need to bring more female, more youthful, more global South voices to this particular period in economic history where we're rethinking the state. Industrial policy is no longer a blasphemy, but where then the granularity of the decisions that we make on how to design policy, on how to rethink the existing institutions like public banks. There's currently 22.2 trillion in national development banks. There's 2.2 trillion in multilateral development banks, but they're not really aligned. The sum is not greater than the parts of the actual projects that are being financed. So lots of money, again, being distributed, but we're not transforming the system through those public banks. So what does it mean to rethink the structure of the relationship, for example, between MDBs, the multilateral development banks, the national development banks, and how they relate to the private sector with, for example, conditionality at the center, but not the old conditionality that restricted the fiscal space, but the kind of conditionality which, for example, the CHIPS Act in the US, through some work that we did with Gina Raimondo, the Secretary of Commerce, has embedded in what, in theory, is a technology program, right, to bring sovereignty around chips in the US, but making sure it embeds a new relationship, a new social contract between public and private. So if you look at the CHIPS Act, it's about $400 billion for chip sovereignty, so it's basically being given out to semiconductor companies, but conditional that those companies reinvest the profits. It's kind of just ground zero in terms of a condition, so don't just give it back to your shareholders through share buybacks and dividend payouts, that they have to pay workers the competitive wage. Now, what exactly that means is debatable, but anyway, at least they put it in there. Improve working conditions and use energy-efficient supply chains. And this is really important. The whole concept of an ecological transition can't just be for the Ministry of Energy. It needs to be interministerial, right? So what does it mean to embed ecological sustainability issues even in a tech program, right? That's what we mean by this interministerial, intergovernmental approach, which perhaps is one of the most important capacities and capabilities that we need in governments. In Brazil right now, it's fascinating. Their ecological transition is actually mainly housed in the finance ministry. There's also, of course, the Minister of the Environment. There's an environmental agenda there. But what we have found in our work with governments is that when the Treasury doesn't buy in, and you have really interesting programs in the Ministry of Health or Ministry of Energy around the what, and then the way that the finance ministry works continues to be the old way, then those policies, by design, can't actually have the effect that they need to for transformative change. Now, ideally, the missions approach that we've been working on would actually sit at a level above that, right? In the president's office, in the cabinet office. And then the question is, what does it mean for all the different ministries? Because well-being is not just for the health ministry. Climate is not just for the environment ministry. That new social contract that I talked about, the dynamic capabilities, without that, nothing can happen, because we then don't have the capacity. And perhaps I'll just finish, because this will really bring us then to this discussion also of new voices, the participation, the co-creation of the policies themselves, but also of the governance, making sure that if we're talking about outcomes, that we're really moving in that direction. And perhaps the work we did with Camden Council, very local, we're all sitting today in Camden land, really helped us, or the team in IIPP learn. And Dan Wainwright, I don't think he's here, but he was one of our students who then worked with us for 2 years in Camden, and now he's been employed. He's now a full-time worker in Camden Council. And there, what he did through kind of thinking about these issues was, if we have, for example, outcomes-oriented procurement, and procurement, don't forget, is often 30% of government budgets, what does it mean to not only have that outcomes orientation, which we have in war, right, the Defense Production Procurement Act that Biden used during COVID? It's not surprising it came out of a wartime moment in the Korean War, because with wars people want to win, so they don't just put in money and stir the soup and pray, they have outcomes orientation. But that wasn't enough. With Camden, they said, we want to make sure that that procurement, which we want it to be outcomes oriented around Camden's missions that we worked on with them, also has a voice of the people who are experiencing the service that is being procured. So the exact example we worked on with Camden was on adult social care in the estates, so social housing, that were part of the Clean Growth mission in Camden. It was focused around 10 housing estates. And the adult social carees, so the people being cared for, and the carers, ended up being critical to this design of this outcomes-oriented, mission-oriented procurement policy. So that voice of those who are experiencing kind of that principle of subsidiarity at the most local level was critical in the design. And we learned that from them. We had no idea about that, right? So working, as I said, in a more humble way with different parts of the world, bringing back that experience to the theory, and so on. So I will stop here and let Leslie introduce our stellar panel. And thank you.
Okay, all right, yeah. Okay, grab your water. So, wow, that was very inspiring as always, Mariana. Thank you. And I think one thing that you said around this practice-based theory, this is why we wanted to have this incredible panel, because we're bringing practitioners and thinkers and economists together to bring new perspectives. And so with that, I wanted to start introducing our panelists to come to the front. So we'll start with Boholo Joy Kenewendo, who is a fellow with the Robert von Weizsäcker Fellowship Program. She, during COP27-28, was a climate change high-level champion advisor, and she's a former Minister of Investment, Trade, and Industry in Botswana. So welcome, Boholo. Very honored to have you here. Great. Grab a seat anywhere. Okay, next up, we have Erica Kramer-Mbula. Erica is a professor of economics at the University of Johannesburg, South Africa, and she's also the chair of a research chair in transformative innovation and sustainable development. Very excited to have you, Erica. Please join us. Grab a chair. Thank you, welcome. And last but not least, we have Carolina Alves, who's the associate professor in economics here at IIPP, UCL. So welcome, great to have you here. Okay, so let me just grab this stool. Welcome, and we have a lot of questions. We want to dig into some of the juicy topics that Mariana framed for us, but maybe given that this is the, it's Rethinking the State Festival, it's a very important moment. It is the moment of the state. The state has arrived. Would love to maybe just start with a few minutes, each of you, to help us understand why is this conversation that we're having now so important? You know, where are you showing up? And maybe Erica, I can start with you. Oh, sorry, Carolina.
Thank you. So, yeah, well, I'm really happy to be here. Oh, is that?
Oh, you might want to hold that.
Oh, do I have to hold? No.
Oh.
Do we do that? No.
Can you hear?
So, I think it'll be okay, right? Yeah?
Yeah.
So, no, thank you very much, all of you for being here, but also thank you to Mariana for giving me this opportunity to co-chair with her this wonderful C, which is the Strategic Economic Alliance. And what I want to try to do in 3 minutes is to explain a little bit what we mean about new voices, new theory, and new practice in this context of industrial policy and why C is necessary. And I will try to do that with an example, which is related to a Brazilian economist called Maria Conceição Tavares, who died 4 days ago.
Oh.
So she was a Brazilian mathematician and economist, born in Portugal but naturalized Brazilian when she fled with her family from the Salazar fascist dictatorship in the 1950s. And Tavares is certainly one of the most prominent economists in Brazil, but also in Latin America, and I hope many of you in the audience have heard of her. Now, when you think about Tavares and her work, you can think about her work perhaps in 2 blocks, right? One is social injustice, and the other one is national, let's say, Latin American development. And it's impossible to think of her work on industrialization without thinking of how she was placing at the center of that discussion the issue of social injustice. So the question is why that was happening, and what was, when you're trying to understand Tavares' thinking and also her life and academic journey, what you see is that she was looking, or she was theorizing, or trying to think about industrialization from the standpoint of the Brazilian reality. That was her standing point. She wasn't in the 50s where the modernization theory, that I assume many of you are familiar here, that you just have to remove obstacles, then countries, they will develop, they will industrialize, they will become rich. She wasn't doing this, right? She was saying, okay, I run away from my family from a terror, from lack of democracy. And then she was looking to Brazil now and she say, okay, here I have a question of inequality, imperialism, social injustice. So how can I understand this country? And when she started as a mathematician working for the BNDES, looking to income distribution, is when she's a mathematician in a way, in a very technical way, but that started driving her to then trying to unveil, to understand what was happening in Brazil regarding these concerns, regarding concerns of inequality and capitalism itself. And it's interesting because as an economist, and now because she died 4 years, 4 days ago, this interview.
How old was she?
She was born in 93, I think, yeah.
Wow.
So there's this interview, a very passionate interview that has been circulating on social media, where she's saying, an economy that's not concerned with social justice is an economy that condemns people to what is happening all over the world. That's the 90s. A brutal concentration of income and wealth, rising unemployment and poverty. And then she finishes saying, if you don't care about social justice, with who pay the bill, you are not a serious economist, but only a technocrat. So in a moment in history, and then I'm heading to the end, when we had this push for modernization theory, which is a theory that was born in the global north. I know Mariana doesn't like this term, discuss that later. No, don't like, but yeah, they'll have...
We'll debate later.
In a moment where we have this push from thinkers from the global north regarding the modernization theory, Maria Conceição Tavares, with many others, was like resisting to that. And instead of removing the obstacles to let capitalism flourish, she was trying to understand why we have inequality in Brazil in the first place, why we're talking about underdeveloped nations and so on. And the reason for that is because she had a very different standing point. So she started trying to understand what it means to be at the periphery of capitalism. And in doing that, she wasn't concerned with technical progress only, which was what has been said that you need to do to then achieve this industrialization and modernize the country. What she was trying to do is say, okay, what's this particularity? What's the specificities that we see in Brazil? Which led her to focus on finance and eventually on the money aspect, but then eventually on the question of international money and the dollar hegemony, which was placing so many constraints in countries in the global south, such as Brazil. So I guess this year I'm finishing, and I can talk more about her if you want. So for us here today, when we have Mariana taking our attention that it's great that industrial policy is back, but how we are doing that, like taking attention to these new voices and a new theory and a new practice, is that it's not just enough to be back. We need to translate that into this new theory. And the way I see that, that's my example, is that we have to try to be a bit more like Tavares, or at least bring Tavares to like many other Tavares out there right now, to our discussion. So what is our standpoint when we're thinking about industrial policy? Who are we reading? Who is dictating, determining our knowledge, the knowledge that we're following? And how we are considering these imbalances and the contradictions of capitalism that we're seeing in different countries? Is always a problem of corruption, really? Or there's something else there? How we can understand that? If for Tavares at her time, international money, the dollar was the main problem, what is the problem now? Is it still the dollar hegemony, or there's something else? How the dollar hegemony has a different vest right now, and we can't do that if we're still relying on the same economic growth model, the structural kind of change, where we have this, there's a lot, oh, hey, that word, facts, and so on. So basically what I'm saying is that we need to think about this standpoint we are theorizing.
Yes, thank you. And you raised so many great points about being grounded in the local reality, the core being social justice. I mean, these are great concepts that we can take into this discussion. Erica, over to you.
Great. I hope everybody can hear me.
Yeah.
I'll make a very quick statement just for the opening, and then we hopefully get into more detail in the discussion. But I perhaps just also to echo what I really appreciate how you put it through the perspective of an individual, an example of an individual, and how that illustrates the importance of not only alternative voices but also female voices in the field of economics. And I think that is through stories like that we can really get a sense of the bigger picture. So that's great. Perhaps my statement is at a bit high level. Just recognizing that we are globally experiencing very profound changes that are challenging the traditional economic models and the traditional economic assumptions. And we are stuck with tools and models that perhaps generally, the ones that are widely used, are not helping us address and tackle these complexities that we are in. So it's really quite a unique juncture that we are with climate change and crisis unfolding, with deepening inequalities within countries, across countries, with a digital transformation and the speed of technological change that is sort of unprecedented. And there are a lot of unknowns, there are a lot of uncertainties, and Mariana used that word in her presentation on how to embrace that. And traditional economic theory does not allow us to deal with uncertainty in very effective ways. So we need fresh ideas on how to tackle these complex issues, and traditional economics has generally focused on growth measures, GDP, and ways of measuring our performance and success that doesn't capture quite well issues around well-being, about environmental sustainability. So new and alternative perhaps ways of thinking can give us the tools to measure other ways of performance and success, such as social equity, climate justice, environmental sustainability, and so on and so forth. And currently the tools that we have do not allow us to do that. So I think we need this thinking to not only respond to the current challenges, but also prepare ourselves for a future in which we actually want to live in. And I think it is possible to shift the direction of change, but it means that we need to be deliberate, almost swimming against the current, and bringing to the fore these alternative ways of thinking. So I think this initiative and this panel, I think, is a step in that direction. So I really appreciate being invited.
That's a great framing, and I hope we can dig into some of those new tools, because I'd love to hear examples of what's working or what do we need to do. So let's hold that thought. Hello, over to you.
Thanks. Let me start off by saying, just as we sat down here, I realized I didn't have my notes.
Oh, okay. But it's in here.
We're going to freestyle this together.
Great, love it. That's what we're all doing.
I think the points that have already been raised really capture the essence of what we need to be doing in the world at the moment. And I particularly liked the slide that you kind of skimmed through on debt. On debt, and I will talk a little bit more about that. But as we say, the industrial policy is going through a renaissance, and maybe UNIDO is excited, so Industrial Development Organization is really excited that they now have a stronger position in the world once again. I just want to remind everybody that some of the things that we're talking about now and that are being re-emphasized were actually mentioned by African presidents, Julius Nyerere for one, in 1966. So these are not new issues, they're not new principles, but it was recognized even in 1966 that in order for the continent to develop, we have to have much more deliberate engagement and implementation of industrial policy, value chain development, and not just that, but unity in a regional value chain, and thinking a little bit more strongly around collaborative sovereignty and what that would look like, and what that would mean in the economic space. So it's been really interesting for me to see how everybody is talking about industrialization and industrial policy now, because it's manifesting in how the US, EU are responding to the influx of green transition products from China. And now all of a sudden we're seeing that, for the longest time, this neoliberal policy of the market will figure itself out. We don't need to intervene, and we don't need to have a deliberate industrial policy. It's actually showing in the lack of strengthened industries. And now as a result, we're having some climate policies that are thinly veiled, or I should say industrial policies and trade policies thinly veiled as climate policies. But it is a reaction to China has been a lot more deliberate with industrialization than many other countries. And for the longest time, these were models, the Chinese model in particular, that we were trying to implement, with the special economic zones, with the value chain development strategies. And we would have a lot of pushback coming from multilateral organizations and MDBs and financiers that, no, laissez-faire is the way to go. Don't be too much government intervention will distort the market. But we are seeing everybody gravitate towards that now. you know, I certainly think that it is bringing into question what is just value chain development and what is just industrial development in the context of the climate emergency that we're currently living in. And segueing a little bit into that climate emergency space, because I think what we will see more of now, particularly in the next 3 to 10 years, is more NDC, nationally determined contributions. She told me no acronyms. Is more now we'll see more NDC diplomacy coming out. And to just explain on that is we are talking about climate finance, we're talking about having highly ambitious countries, and we all want to gravitate towards responding to this climate emergency through the UNFCCC process and beyond. But we are not talking about how we are adequately going to be financing this transition and the actions towards the climate emergency. And it brings me to, if we do not have the right response on this new qualitative goal around climate finance, then we would truly be failing not only on just transition and our common climate goals, but we would be failing on the very critical aspect, in my opinion, of just value chain and industrial development. Because when we are talking about industrialization now, or industrialization within the green space, we're just talking about China, US, EU. But where are the minerals coming from?
Yeah.
The critical minerals, where are they coming from? Where are they based? As it stands, if we look at renewable energy investments, only 2.4% of them go to the continent. Even for development of value addition to the critical minerals, it's less than 3%. And yes, yet 30% of the critical minerals we need for the transition are in the continent. The math is not mathing. You know, something is wrong here. And if in our NDC diplomacy we're not dealing and addressing that particular aspect, then we're not dealing with public service with a purpose.
Yeah.
You know, we are losing out on creating jobs, on reducing poverty, on the critical aspects of the SDGs. And we've argued quite recently that if climate action and responding to the climate emergency doesn't meet the national goals associated with development, then we are completely missing the mark on really innovating in the right policies and in diplomacy.
Absolutely. So great concepts there. The imbalance in policies. I think let's dig into that because I want to understand your perspective, where you're coming from. Mariana, do you want to tie this up? Tell us where you are.
So first of all, much better without notes.
Yeah, it's great.
So I was just scribbling some quick notes here. But maybe just, I mean, what I skipped over in the presentation was actually some examples that we're learning from and that are incredibly good kind of fertile soil for this issue, not just of new voices, but also not clumping countries into these blocks, whether it's like European countries. There could not be more difference between Italy and Germany. And as an Italian, I can tell you all sorts of reasons. I mean, we have much better food, but all sorts of issues around their national innovation system that are completely missing, for example, in Italy. The BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, I don't know, I mean, what actually unites them, right? So by talking about countries, whether it's global south, global north, of course that matters, especially we're talking about debt and the injustice where many countries in the so-called global south are spending much more in debt interest payments than they do in any of their social or climate priorities because of this very problematic structure of the global financial system. By the way, the Bridgetown Initiative being led by Mia Motley, if you're interested in, I see Jamie Grumman there who has helped lead it. You know, look at that for details of what I just said. But you know, as I said before, even when the finance arrives, if we don't have the right institutional capacity, the training, so on and so forth, then even with, as I mentioned, without even talking about the global south, a country like Italy then can't even, you know, transform. And so what we've been doing is actually getting our hands dirty with particular countries. And just some quick examples. In Colombia right now, what's interesting is not just like the talk, for example, about ecological transition. It is also about this issue, which is difficult, by the way. None of these examples are about perfection, just the struggles, right? The challenges and opportunities around what they're calling the economía popular, the popular economy, which is not about formalizing the informal sector, but it really is about that participatory element, whether it's in how we organize energy communities, which, by the way, is a concept that's out there in the world, which is super interesting because energy communities are about how do you create energy, but also distribute that energy in an equitable, sustainable way. So the communities that are also creating the energy also own and can govern, coming back to that also example in Camden with the Community Wealth Fund, some interesting principles there related to it. But also part of that economía popular came back to that issue of how do we not just do outcomes-oriented, mission-oriented procurement, but that issue of voice and co-creation. So they have a program now thinking about what does it mean to democratize procurement, right? And again, I keep going from countries like Colombia, and then Camden, my neighborhood, just because that's exactly what we try to do, that local, the global, and how do we scale up the lessons that we're learning. In Brazil, and I see that we had Chico Gaetani there, who's wonderful, who's been helping lead the work we're doing in Brazil, specifically with the Ministry of Public Administration, led by Minister Esther Dweck, very inspirational young minister. They're in charge of SOEs, digital government, and state-owned enterprises. What does it mean to rethink the design of these organizations, or even the need for digital government in order, for example, in terms of how we design digital platforms? Think of the work here with public digital. You might have known people like Mike Bracken, David Eves, who work closely with Mike Bracken. Like, why do we need a digital governance led with notions of public value and the common good to help ministries actually work together, right, around these goals like an ecological transition? But the most interesting thing perhaps we've been doing recently in Brazil is with the health ministry, Minister Trindade, but also with her Undersecretary Carlos Gadelha, who used to run Field Crews. What's super interesting in Brazil that's happening on health is bringing together what I will call the entrepreneurial state, that I wrote about 11 years ago, and the welfare state, which are usually totally separate. Think of the US. They have innovation state, $40 billion a year put into health innovation, and then Medicare and Medicaid, if you want, which is the more redistributary part of it, but in no connection whatsoever. So the prices that are being charged to the welfare system don't take into account at all the role of that public investment, right? So again, the socialization of risk, privatization of rewards. The interest in organizations like ARPA-E, ARPA-H, or even DARPA is that within the organization, these aren't just innovation agencies, but they've often thought about the investment side and the access side together, but we don't have that usually in how we run departments, whether it's energy or health. And it's interesting that the Brazil's health transformation agenda is trying to bring together what they call the health economy industrial complex. So these lessons about the military industrial complex, right? Like no one would say fund the war just by throwing money and hope for the best. That's why they have that outcomes orientation. What does it mean to bring that to our social problems? So this is just an example of some of the work we're doing where we're trying to learn what does it even mean to talk about a health economy industrial complex. And just lastly, perhaps in Barbados, what's been really interesting is that to be the cleanest, most sustainable large ocean state with tourism at the center, what does that mean for a new relationship with the hotel chains, where they need to start investing and not just extracting value into the workers working in those hotels for the training around repurpose, reuse, recycle. And they tried, by the way, through a pact during COVID, when the hotels weren't being used, because we were all locked up, locked down, whatever that was, and actually the hotels refused, right? So there's this isn't a harmonious process, right? This is a bit of a struggle, which perhaps we can bring back so that we're not pretending this is a ballet. It's also a battle, and what does it mean to put the new social contract between all the different actors at the center?
I love that. And this is practice-based theory in action with these examples. So I want to pick up on something that, Eric, you had said, because we do need new tools. And when we look at industrial policy, it's based on certain assumptions that probably aren't right. And these are the assumptions that are putting us in this mess anyway and not helping us build a well-being economy, for example. So we'd love to hear your thoughts on what's wrong right now in industrial policies in terms of assumptions, and actually what could be right? What are those tools that we should be looking at? What are the assumptions that should be behind it?
Should I start?
Yeah, please.
Perhaps I can refer to the context of African countries, because that is where I live. That's where my work is primarily oriented towards Africa. But yes, I mean, it's industrial policy and similar to other countries in the world, as it was mentioned earlier. It's alive and kicking, and most countries in Africa would have one way or another of a strategy or a policy supporting industrialization. There was a report that I came across of the African Development Bank showing that I think 37 African countries have shown positive move towards industrializing in terms of value. They issue value addition, moving towards more value addition activities. The industrialization side of employment is a bit more sided in that.
Okay.
But one way or another, industrialization is happening, industrial policy is moving forward, but I think there are a few problems, ongoing problems with it. One of it, and perhaps I'll be quick, so I won't elaborate and then too much, but one of them is that it's very much focused on sectors, priority sectors and priority technologies, which usually represents the voices of large players. These are big companies running specific, there's a lot of industrial concentration in specific sectors. Therefore, if you focus on priority sectors and priority technologies, you tend to sort of represent those voices. In contrast with that, we are in a context where 80 to 85% of all employment in the continent is informal. About 90% of businesses in the continent are micro, small, and medium enterprises. 85% of them are informal businesses. Informality is not something that happens in the margins. In many countries, is the economy. So if you leave out informal actors and informal voices from designing industrial policy, what are you building? Who are you building for, right? So I think that is a big missing part in the industrial policy domain in Africa. Another one is that we often, I think, is disconnected to a large extent. It's often siloed. So we talk about industrial policy, sub-regional industrialization strategies, and so on and so forth, but it's usually siloed and is looked at in the economic domain. I think Mariana made mention earlier about, this is not only about the ministry of, that deals with trade and industry, it's actually across sectors. For instance, one of the preconditions for industrialization is energy access. 600 million Africans lack electricity access. This is half of the people in the continent. Without electricity, you can't talk about functioning education, health, businesses can't run without electricity, and industries can't run without electricity. So the challenge of powering the continent has to come hand in hand with considerations around industrialization, particularly powering, relying on renewable energies. I think Popolo made the point that we are only tapping the surface of our renewable energy potential. Is about 1% of the solar potential, 7% of hydro. There's very little that we are utilizing, and then industrial policy becomes much broader than that. You need to bring in energy, renewable energy at scale for industrialization to happen. Then another issue, CSD, you want to come in?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Hopefully with solutions. Are you coming with solutions? Okay, good. Hold that thought. One more issue?
Yes. Another issue has to do with what it was mentioned earlier, right? We are constantly in this pattern of emulate best practices. Best practices are coming from elsewhere, and then you sort of, if you want to have a good industrial policy, then copy what countries that have gone through this journey before have achieved. That doesn't work, and particularly when you talk about green industrialization. as it was mentioned earlier, for green industrialization and the digital transformation is very mineral intensive. That means that most of the minerals that are needed for the green industrialization of the North are sitting in Africa.
Yeah.
We are not producing enough solar panels to consume all the silver that is needed to produce it. We are not producing enough batteries to use all the lithium that is. So we have to export it.
Yeah.
Therefore, it becomes a new scramble for Africa.
Yeah.
We are creating systems that are producing and reproducing the patterns and distortions of the colonial legacies that we are trying to move away from.
Yeah.
Therefore, I think it's very important to take into account geopolitical dynamics, power imbalances, interests groups, and all of these things that we are leaving out of current economic thinking and industrial policy thinking, so that African countries and developing countries at large can reclaim and sort of set up the parameters in terms of regulation to gain out of this.
So let me turn this. I don't know if this is what you're going to say, but you're going to help us understand what the solution is. No, because I'd love to maybe pull on what you were saying, Mariana, before about the new economic thinking and how do we take concepts of that and flip this? You know, how do we prevent a scramble for Africa? So, is that what you're going to say? Okay, well, please,
I
go.
wanted to say something on the new economic thinking, which Erica gave a perfect example in you talking, you asked Erica about new tools. And the example of informality is very interesting to also push the discussion to new economic thinking. And if you think, I don't have the data exactly, sadly, but I know it's over 65% of the workforce in the world is informal, right? Yet, our economic theory has the starting point of formality, the labor market. So how we then get the developing countries, the third world countries, whatever they call it, to then have formal labor market, right? So the standpoint is quite important because we are not starting, like the informality is exception, even if it's over 65% of the labor force around the world. And that matters a lot. If you take the literature on labor informality in India, which is extremely rich, we don't teach them to our students because this is the exception for two reasons. First of all, the starting point is not the labor formality, it's not the formal aspect. But second of all, because it's a knowledge produced in the global south. So therefore, it's not what we're teaching in the top departments in economics around the world. So I think this is a great example why what we mean about new economic thinking and the plurality of approach and so on. So that's all I want to say.
Thank you.
Sadly, it's not a solution.
Well, it's part of the solution. So, okay, well, let me flip this because you talked earlier, Mariana, about this amazing new thing, and core to it is bringing new voices. And I think, Bokola, I was very struck when you said, look, this is not new stuff. We were talking about this in the 60s in Africa. You know, so I guess would love to hear, first of all, you are all amazing women doing amazing things. What is it about where you come from that's bringing a different perspective to the solutions? Question number one.
Okay. So I wanted to add a little bit on what is wrong with the industrial policy. And just quickly, I think it's the big con. You know, it's read it. Shameless plug. It's the big con in that we've had a lot of industrial development policies being done externally, and as a result, they are devoid of political goals and political ambitions and alignment with domestic political interests. And I have personally seen this where, you know, a strategy is done elsewhere and you look at it, and during the report back session, you keep asking questions to a point where you say, okay, it's fine, thank you. And that is why many people then come back and say, yeah, but this country is not serious about implementing the strategy that we gave them. Yes, it's because the strategy is not in alignment with the goals, with the challenges, with the needs. It has been parachuted in, and therefore it fails to respond to the actual needs. And then secondly, there's been this a strong push now for us to think about the role of indigenous knowledge, indigenous products in our new economies. And that is more so because, we had this expectation that the modern economic market will eventually bring everybody in. And but we've seen with the rate of the informal sector that the market is not responding as it was expected to. I mean, we've been 60 years doing this thing, and the informal sector keeps growing, and it's because primarily you're forcing people to act in an economic space that they're not used to, that they have no comparative advantage in, that they can't even gain competitive advantage in. I mean, and you've allowed for people to let indigenous knowledge to rot. And that is a very prime area where we could be tapping into. And there's something that we had started working on, spatial planning, that recognizes the indigenous knowledge, indigenous products in different parts of the country that can actually be commercialized. We can add technology and do something that is worthwhile for our domestic economy, but also for exporting. And then lastly, has been, most countries are small. This very insular thinking, again, if you look at Julius Nyerera's speech from 1966, he says there is a challenge to the Pan-Africanist. Do you think more about nationalist development, or do you start to think more about regional and continental development? And where do those two things meet? And it's been so interesting to see this revived push towards the AFCFTA. You must check. Towards the AFCFTA, because we're going back to those issues of we are better with more united economies, because when you go into the market with a 2 million population, like Mazzucato, you're told this is too small. Yet we have all the governance parameters in place. And then there's this constant push of the race to the bottom that has also really made sure that we do not fully implement the industrial policy. We can't keep raising to the bottom. And as Avinash says in Barbados, you keep shifting the flag post of what we need to do in order to attract capital. Without, the right quality of capital.
So, Mariana, I'd love to hear your perspective on how do you get these new voices in? You talked about the indigenous piece. What is best practice? What are you seeing? How are you getting the new voices? And then after you say that, I want to open it up to a couple voices out there. If we have some questions and time for that, I think.
Great.
Love to hear this.
So thanks. I do want to relate it though to your other question, which we sort of didn't answer, because they're related.
Yes.
It doesn't mean anything to bring new voices to the table. It becomes tokenistic, and there's lots of tokenism out there about new voices, if we don't actually value those voices, right? That's why the whole indigenous knowledge piece is critical. If you don't value those communities, then when they do come to the table, it's meaningless, and it's actually insulting, and it's condescending. And so that needs to be underpinned by a new theory of value, right? And so, that becomes part of that new economic thinking. And that's a new theory of value. For example, there's all this talk out there about stakeholder value. Why? Because a lot of corporates have been put under attack. Close to $10 trillion. That's 12 zeros for those who've forgotten. That's not an acronym, but just in case you forgot. That's been used just to buy back shares, to boost stock prices, stock options, executive pay. That represents a lack of reinvestment back into the system, with the physiocrats back in the 1700s called the sterility in the system. They were looking at the landlords who weren't reinvesting the money back in, but just kind of clothing themselves well or going to war. That notion that actually we need to move away from shareholder value in the corporate sector towards stakeholder value can't just be another gimmick, right, about corporate governance. It needs to be a different way to create that value in the first place in a pre-distributive way in terms of how all these different actors work together. And that includes the indigenous community. It includes labor unions. One of the biggest things that happened recently in the US was this United Auto Workers strike, where they, for the first time in their history, this is one of the biggest trade unions in the US, struck against the 3 big auto companies. Why? Because otherwise the green transition, which sounds good because it's green, is a race to the bottom, right? If battery workers are getting paid a third of what unionized, GM workers are getting paid. That's no good. By the way, that was a huge success, that strike. Hardly talked about in the global papers, right? That also needs to be something we learned from. How was it done? What was, negotiated? What was the platform through which, government, private sector, trade unions actually work together? In Australia, where where Dan is now, it was really interesting where the ACTU, their big trade union federation, and trying to think about this mission-oriented approach that we often talk about, they said, well, without principles of justice, so First Nations principles, right, and labor justice principles, then these missions can just become kind of, new bottles, new wine, old wine in new bottles, right? So what are the new principles of justice? Just like in Barbados, they wanted to underpin their 6 missions that they worked with us on with cross-cutting principles around identity, justice, well-being, value, self-worth. Mia Motley often says that the worst thing she experiences when she goes into schools is little kids who kind of look up her and say, hello, Prime Minister. She's like, look at me. And she says that redemption song, right, should be in the national curriculum in terms of bringing back that self-worth, right? So, again, self-worth, what does it mean in an economics way where we're actually underpinning this with a new theory of value creation, that pre-distribution, not just the redistribution. So many progressive parties have, I think, gotten stuck by talking a lot about the redistribution, but without a different theory, a progressive theory of wealth creation and value creation. And then when they do, then you have a bit of, and I don't want to go into politics here because we're not in PERDA, right? We're not politicians. But anyway, here, let me just say it, the Labour Party, we all kind of, well, at least I think. But, how boring is this constant discussion of, we'll have, 29 billion for a green economy, but, there's no money. But actually, when Germany was saying that around there's no money, then the war happens in Ukraine, 190 billion out of thin air, right? So when we care about stuff, when it's treated as urgently and it's seen as national security, money comes out of thin air. When it's societal, it doesn't. So again, theory of money creation, but also of expansion of productive capacity. What we saw after the financial crisis was a lot of countries were forced, in order to receive the recovery funds, and I'm thinking of the so-called PIGS in Europe. I'm Italian, so I'm allowed to say it. Portugal, Italy, Greece, and Spain. Goldman Sachs called us the PIGS. Great. They also came up with the word BRICS. Anyway, they forced countries to reduce their deficits in order to access the recovery funds. What happened? They all reduced their deficits, where they were competing on that. Spain cut its publicly funded R&D by 40% in order to get the low deficit to access those funds. Surprise, surprise, what happens? Deficits fall, debt to GDP rises. Absolutely. It's not rocket science. All you need is basic math. X over 0 is infinity. Do they know that? They probably know that. Right? So if you're cutting without strategy, without catalyzing that public and private investment in a catalytic way that gets the private sector to do their job, the public sector to do their job, you get a lower deficit, but the denominator and all the determinants of the denominator don't grow. So productivity. I think only Zimbabwe and Haiti have had lower productivity growth than Italy, by the way. I keep bragging on Italy. I'm allowed to because it's my country. We can all, right? But anyway, but the point is, all of this needs that new economic thinking. And the point is, we can't just rant about this as I just did. We need to then learn not only on the kind of practical examples and working with them, but when we are working with them, we don't work at people. We work with them, both in terms of how we work with the civil servants on the ground, but what this alliance is going to try to do is also really create a new pipeline, right, of young female academics, because you might have seen in the Financial Times last year, there was many articles, there was a whole series on how economics is the discipline that has least female scholars. My father's in nuclear fusion. There's more women doing nuclear fusion than economic theory, right? So we need new female voices. We need those voices to be in those parts of the world that have been unheard. We need also a new generation, and not just to have, me, Roderick Stiglitz, and whoever it is that parachute in to talk about the new economics, but it's our responsibility also as an institution, and I see this as an institution that I run, to use the fact that we have that platform often from the very top. We have the presidents, the prime ministers calling us in, and then we work with the civil servants to open up that access, and this should be true of others, I'm just using our own example, of that platform to really learn not just with those practitioners, but also to bring in new voices, because perhaps what we're saying itself is outdated, precisely because it hasn't had that kind of sense of renovation.
Yeah. Wonderful points. I think I only have a couple more minutes, but if I can go over, can I go over? Who's the boss? You're the boss. All right, let's take one question, and then we're going to go and have some final reflections.
Should we take 3 questions? I would take 3 or 4. Do we just?
Okay. Oh gosh, all these questions. Mariana, how late can we go?
I'd say we take 3 or 4 questions, we apologize that we went over,
Yeah.
and then we just answer them, and I won't, because I think it's good for others to talk.
Wonderful. And there are drinks after this, so
yeah,
that's
there's
your
drinks.
reward for staying longer. Okay, so we'll start with you and then go over to you. Yes, please.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
I got a loud voice. But it's all running
It's good to
Yeah, it's for the
Okay.
video.
Should I stand up? Why not?
No.
Hi, can everyone hear me? Yeah, good?
Yeah.
All right.
And say your name, please.
My name is Alexandra Proctor. This was a fantastic talk. Thank you so much for your insights there. I really, really enjoyed that. I think I come from an interesting background in that I started out my career running a startup. So when I was a student at UCT, I was a South African. I built a company which became Africa's largest student housing platform. I think I point about the president to sit on South Africa's National Development Agency. And it was this massive transition going from startups to then going to government. You know, there's millions of young South Africans that are unemployed, and our biggest issue is how do we get young South Africans employed? It's like critical. We take it from every single possible angle we possibly can. And I found some comments interesting about value creation, because in my experience, value creation doesn't come from government. It comes from startups. That value genesis, when you're going like a 0 to 1, when you're taking almost out of thin air, people creating things that are then growing, has, in my experience, come from startups. And I know the most extraordinary startup founders across South Africa, and across the world that are building remarkable things. And in my experience, government's been more of a referee than an actual player in the game. But now that I'm working so much in government and really leaning into this role, I feel like it's so critical that government can create value and can be that value genesis. How does that happen? I mean, I don't know if I'm seeing this from a very anecdotal point of view, but I'd love some examples of how government can create value on the scale that I've seen with startups. Obviously, Kennedy's Apollo program comes to mind right now, but any other examples or way of thinking that we can have that sort of startup value genesis thinking going into government in the way that we see in startups, which I think is truly extraordinary. Thank you.
Mariana, you cannot answer that question because that's your
She almost
book.
gave me a heart attack, but it's okay.
She wrote a whole book on that. All right, who wants to take that one?
Should we take a couple?
Oh yeah, let's take a
Yeah,
few.
sorry. Yeah,
Okay.
We were going to take
So-
3 or 4.
Yeah. Okay, great. Gentleman there. Okay, so
Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity. I'm Oh Ryung-jin from the SOAS, and then I'm the one who asked a question to the Borderless Africa. Okay, so I want to talk about maybe industrial policy would come back because of insecurity of all of global, like North and South are experiencing, because there's some of dynamic of chicken game, because Union European try to make a profit also, like for the ecology, but like economically. So they created this dynamic, but China is providing 80% of materials of green energy. So without creating winning dynamic in the global south, it can be super difficult, because that Congo is producing a lot of rare earth items for the batteries, but we never talk about this because this item is very important for the Belgium trade and Rwanda also. So we don't talk about many things, but without including this global south, how can we sustainable? And then why not we can create this refinery in African continent? You see that the borderless Africa is not possible if you don't create any intermediate commodity producing factories in African soil. So without including this global south, it's an empty word. I mean, the financing, but we have to always send these things and buy from the China. So why don't we create a new dynamic and make some market or production base in Africa so we can collaborate, win-win?
yes is the answer to that. Easy answer. Who else? I said, okay.
Yeah.
There, hand. Yep. Lady in the black. Yep.
How this is okay. Hi, I'm Carla. I'm an assistant professor. I really loved your perspective, and I completely see like, this is what I wish the world would like. But my point is, how do you engage governments in this kind of thinking? And I'm Italian, as you, Professor Mazzucato. I'm from the south of Italy. It's completely different development world with respect to the north, where I do live, and where I spent my entire period of life as a teenager and as a student and as a worker. And how do you engage government? Because all the examples you were bringing were Mia Motley. She was participating at a COP, and she was one of the faces of the leaders of the COP. And this is a virtuous example. But if I have to look at Italy, and as you were saying, no, our government was not able to provide the proper infrastructure with respect to the money that are received from the European Union. So how can we make this happen when our democracies right now are not going toward that kind of direction, but most of the world, as just the election from the European Union, from the UK, we're showing a different trend.
Yes, I knew someone would bring up the election, so that's a very good question. Let's take one more, and then we'll go back to the panelists. I want to be equitable. Who? Okay. Standing? Yeah, standing guy over there.
Hi, thanks a lot for this very interesting panel. I actually learned a lot. But the question that I actually wanted to ask is regarding the sea. So we've talked a lot about justice and how justice can be defined in different contexts. But does the sea propose a definition of justice which can be shared? What is it that we have in common from all these contextualized definitions of the value chains that we have spoken, but also the indigenous knowledge that we have also mentioned upon? But what exactly binds us together when we're talking about justice? Is there a possibility for heterodox economics or political economy to contribute to this debate? And how does sea insert itself in this debate? Thanks.
Great. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to stop there. I wish we could be here all night. All right, so we have 4 really good questions/comments. Can government compete with the shiny new startups? So that's a good one. I love the point about the power dynamics, global north, global south. Sorry to use those terms, but how do we come up with a new reality, especially around the critical minerals? There is a question around how to actually engage government. So this is the real nitty-gritty how. How do we get them to step up, especially in light of the elections? And justice, great point about justice. And how does that relate to what we're trying to do here? And yeah, how do you make that a reality? So let's maybe just go down the line, and I'd love you, take whatever you want to respond to.
Okay, well, oh dear.
But 1 minute each. Yeah, time's up.
That's very good, thank you. So, regarding the startups, I have to say that you do need to read Mariana, and it's not just because she's my boss. I want to say something as well, because that's a myth. It's another myth we have to burst. But one thing I always bring to my students, not the ones that are here, when I used to teach macro, is the question of the government economic sector in terms of employment. It's something that's not what Mariana is saying, like the wealth that is created just through the state employing people that people just dismissed. So I don't know what you mean by value creation or value itself if you're really looking in terms of quantification of money. But if it's money in investment creativity, read Mariana. But if it's not even that, if it's the question of who is working in the economy, look at the US and other countries, how actually the public sector is huge in terms of employment. The other thing, regarding the industrial policy, power dynamics, I totally agree. I think there's a question here of transfer value and so on that we don't talk enough, even when you talk about value chain and so on. The question, for example, the lithium with Latin America, that has the largest reserve of lithium. However, all the batteries will be producing in South Asia. So again, the extraction is the primarization, again, is the extraction, is the same development model, and then the aggregate value goes to Asia, and then the batteries goes to SUV in the US. I don't know why they need so many SUVs. So I think the question here is a power dynamic, and sadly, that's another thing C is doing, is trying to push the heterodoxy, the political economy aspect, through the door of Mariana or people such as the Whole America that are already in the policy-making world is actually discuss power, right? To discuss that and give voice for people who are challenged this. I don't think there's a formula, but yeah. So should I just do this too, and then?
Yes, please. Yeah, I want to give everyone a chance to speak. So please, Erica.
Yes, I'll be quick as well because I think it's one of these questions sort of deserves a much longer answer, but. One of them was how do you engage with governments? Yes, I will talk from my experience, but I think others are also doing that. I think there are different ways in which one can engage with government in these discussions. Part of it has to do with general discussions, awareness raising, capacity building, both ways. As Mariana put it, as a theory-based practice and practice-based theory, that requires discussion and in both ways. But another way of doing it is in very practical ways. A lot of government departments and officials there is an appetite in some cases, and you have to find those that are sort of open to that, to doing things differently. And policy experimentation and taking more experimental ways to tackle unknown issues that are sort of very contextual, very specific to an area or a particular time, require a new way of doing things. And then it's when you bring your stakeholders to the table, you become one of the voices, you become a facilitator of those discussions. And in very practical ways, you can engage with governments in doing that, in engaging with this co-created, participatory way of developing solutions. And through those avenues, I think it's quite effective. I wanted to quickly talk to the justice question.
Yes, that's a good one.
Yes, there was, so you asked a question about justice, very quickly.
It's magic.
Where's Wally?
Very difficult. Justice is a very contextual concept. And I think in these spaces that we're talking about, where there is sort of the participatory space where government, academia, different stakeholders, civil society, communities take part into collectively discussing what is justice in a specific context. You need those spaces and you need to contextualize this. And this is one of the difficulties of the approach that we're taking, because it's we deal with complexity, and complexity means that you need to get into these very difficult conversations, and you don't have one definition of justice that is valid for all contexts at all times.
But should you? Should there be one definition?
Not necessarily.
Not that, that's what I said.
Yeah. Good.
Let me start from what C will do, or the aspirations. For example, I became an economist because I had dinner with economists. Not because I was given proper career guidance. It's a long story, but it's somewhere in the internet. But eventually, after a few years of practicing, mainly focusing on macroeconomic policy, I learned that we had a shortage of trade economists. And so when we go to negotiate, many African countries find themselves overpowered by the other side, whoever the other side is. And so what we hope this space will do is to really facilitate the growth of experts in economics that are representative of our various geographic spaces, but also of new thinking, of energy, of vigor on how we can change our economies. And that's actually how Mariana and I reconnected, I will tell you. But it's because, we've been mentoring young African economists and taken them to the WTO Public Forum to engage in a much more multilateral policy space so that they can go back and we can start to really grow this network of effective and hopefully more energetic economists in the trade space in particular. So I'm hoping that it's not to dictate what we think or what the thinking here is, but is that C will provide a space of listening and co-creation.
Yeah.
In terms of value chain development in the continent, we completely agree. Completely agree. I do not think it's fair, the 30% versus 3% capital mobilization for renewable energy in particular. It is even more expensive to buy solar panels in the continent. It doesn't make sense when all the resources are from there. I don't know if you mentioned the Borderless Africa book, because I recently read that. Okay, cool, okay. Yes, yes. And then with Francis. Yeah, okay, cool. And then lastly, just looking at how you engage governments. I know this is within a context of functional governments, but I'm always aware that we have governments in crisis or people that are stateless. And so the question is always, how do these perhaps multilateral systems provide space for people that are stateless and now are working in governments in crisis? How do we better provide space for them to engage in policy making globally? Within the UNFCCC process, I just want to highlight that there's the non-state actor side that is really lobbying and rallying civil society, private sector, and others that might be thinking about, okay, if I am stateless or with a government in crisis, how do I then ensure that the global policymaking space doesn't leave me behind? And then more for those with governments that are semi-functional, because I don't think any is fully functional. There are processes. We had the Chamber of Commerce that really lobbied for creation of a space called the High Level Consultative Council that would bring issues across different ministries or sectors, and they would be targeted or channeled through these ministries, and then the president would ask everybody, put everybody on the spot and ask them to respond and challenge them to act much more effectively. So, there could be ways of creating real engagement by lobbying and forcing governments to respond through HLCCs amongst others. I think that is it.
Yeah, thank you. Very, very complete answer. Mariana, over to you, and then we're going to...
Sorry. The last thing is so that she doesn't say it.
Yes.
Is, actually, my first book I read by Mariana was just on that many people think Silicon Valley created itself, but it didn't.
Yes.
It was through much assistance of government. So there's a role for government to play to create those vibrant startups. And it is with deliberate investment that we actually diversify. Diversification isn't going to come from the sky. It needs deliberate and concerted investment in these spaces, both infrastructure in a policy manner and then infrastructure in real form, and investments into the businesses and industrial policy.
Yep.
I have to highlight something.
You go, girl.
Just on that, it's not just the role that the government has, historically has happened that way. It hasn't happened the other way.
Yeah.
So there's no way that startups will happen without the government. In history hasn't happened. That's why I need to read her book.
Yes.
But I want to say
book.
something about just Mariana, because I don't have to say here. Just Erica brought that in my mind when she was talking about justice. I think I have to say that.
Please.
In our manifesto, one thing that when you're talking about new practice, we are highlighting the cultural shift, which economists, they don't even study culture. Or if they do, we can talk about that, there's efficiency there. But when you talk about the new practice, if you get in our manifesto, we are saying we can't do any structural transformation, dynamic capabilities change without a cultural shift. Right? And this cultural shift I have to read because it's so cool. This cultural shift is moving away from a focus on following bureaucratic, complaints, biased, Eurocentric processes from a fear of getting wrong, towards a culture of learning in which there is permission to innovate, iterate, and here's for usual, and engage with a culture of cultures often theorized as less developed. Because when you're engaging with countries, especially for the global south, what is we are inferior, right? You have to catch up and become as cool as developed countries. So when you're talking about justice, the first thing you should do is to listen to what is justice. And that's not cultural relativism, if there is any sociologists or political theorists in the room, but it's about, we kind of consider that these cultures, they have as spaces on the table as the fake self-interest culture that actually we have in economics. So how we do this cultural shift is very important for C. And for us now, and this of course takes time, but what we want to do now is at least bring the voices to the table, that will give a different perspective of what justice is. Sorry, Mariana, I had to say.
Okay, Mariana, I'll give you the last word because we're quite late, and then I need to close. So over to you.
I mean, so first of all, you're right. There's a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? I mean, that's the whole point. We end up with governments, perhaps, that aren't creative, that don't create value, but you ended up by saying they can, but what do they need to do? But we don't. We're not crazy. Like, we're not saying there are all these entrepreneurial states by not actually even having the new training, which we provide here, but also just that different framework of collective value creation. There's no reason for a government to invest in its capacity and capability if it's being designed ex-ante to just fix and put patches and bandages, right? So there's a bit of that, but also, I mean, just the history. It's not just that everything that makes your smartphone smart and not stupid was publicly funded, basically, through also the private sector, through outcomes-oriented procurement, but, internet, GPS, touchscreen, Siri, that's the Silicon Valley story I tell in the entrepreneurial state, but also the startups that were involved, and startups, of course, matter. I often laugh when people call them gazelles, because if you think of what a gazelle is, it's an animal that's like eating grass, and then it just sprints really, really fast, and then gets eaten by a lion. Like, how is that a good thing? How is that a good thing? How is that a good metaphor? The startups that actually scale, because that's what we want, scale-ups. It's really interesting, for example, again, looking at examples instead of just big, high-level statements. Denmark today is the #1 provider of high-tech green digital services, to China, which is spending over $4 trillion on, reducing the material content of the manufacturing sector in order to reduce their carbon emissions. Now, how did that happen? We actually even Dan here and some other of us have been doing case studies on how that outcomes-oriented procurement becomes a funnel actually for that scaling up process. So it's not just the supply side kind of investment side that we need, investor first resort, not just lender of last resort, but the demand pull policies that can come from a city level procurement or whatever to allow a startup scene to actually have a market to serve was absolutely critical in the US for the startup scene to actually be relevant. But just on this kind of self-fulfilling prophecy, I mean, in Italy, not only the problems I mentioned, but their development pathway was exactly the problem that was mentioned, which is also a problem in Africa. So the North, right, in order to get subsidies, got subsidies from the government to set up a factory in the South, like Fiat, right, through the Casa del Mezzogiorno, set up factories in the South, got a subsidy for it, but all the knowledge and the value remained up north, right? So as long as this lithium extraction is happening in the global South, but then the knowledge is somewhere else and the value chain is somewhere else, and those countries in the global South don't have industrial strategies to diversify using, for example, digital services, right? So the whole, it's not just up the value chain to produce the batteries, it's diversify so that you end up with the whole digital services sector around those minerals, but also the conditionality point that I mentioned is absolutely critical with lithium, for example, because lithium currently might look good for the electrification agenda, but it's terrible for the water agenda, right? The SDGs that I began with are actually all related. And if by trying to solve one, you create a problem on another, we're looking at this in the Global Commission on the Economics of Water that Luca helps with, water is a problem, it's not a sector, and there should be conditions attached to the lithium manufacturers in the global South and the global North, that they need to invest and innovate in order to make sure that that extraction is, more sustainable. And that requires investment, it requires training, it requires, innovation, which ultimately can also drive growth,
Yes.
And, you know, we hope that this, you know, this is just emerging. We have lots of our students here, PhD students, master's students. We also have Bridget here in the room who helps run our applied learning program, where we always say all these things have to happen alongside not just changing the curriculum, but working with civil servants who are learning with us, because we learned from them. But, you know, it's not about just better policy design or even a better business practice or a startup. It really is about that systemic change and bringing those new voices, and that relationship between the theory and practice is what we've been talking about. So join us for a drink.
Yeah, thank you.